featuring, oh yes, we're going to record. Good job, Shada. Featuring a deep dive on water collection, water data collection, um, featuring some of the lessons and examples out of NRDC and NCLC's Water Affordability Advocacy Toolkit. If you weren't able to join a previous webinar that provided an overview of that toolkit, we have a recording that we can share as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Olivia to do some more intros and get us all started. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Erin. And thanks to everybody for joining us today to talk about water affordability, data collection, and transparency. I'm Olivia Wine, a staff attorney at the National Consumer Law Center, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. I'll provide a brief overview that sort of frames today's discussion. Then we're going to hear from our first speaker, Michael Claiborne, directing attorney with the Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, who'll be talking about the importance of data for environmental justice and data collection work in California. Next, my colleague, Karen Lusson, who's a staff attorney with the National Consumer Law Center, will be describing the water data collection efforts in Illinois and showing how that data is being used. And she's also going to highlight elements of a model bill. And finally, we'll hear from Larry Levine, Urban Water Infrastructure and Senior Attorney with National Resources Defense Council. And Larry will be discussing water data collection efforts in New Jersey, as well as other federal and state angles on obtaining water data, because there's more than one way to get this. Be tenacious. We're going to save time at the end for questions, but if there are clarifying questions along the way, I'll be tracking the chat and asking those questions after each speaker goes. So please put your questions in the chat. And with that, I will start with the overview. So next slide, please. Last year, NRDC and NCLC published the Water Affordability Advocacy Toolkit. And as a sort of brief recap, next slide, please. The toolkit is made up of multiple brief modules on different topics. And these next couple of slides will show you how you can sort of lump together the modules by three overarching topics. So the first topic would be protecting people from losing access to water. So we have several modules on strategies to avoid water disconnections. Next slide. The next overarching topic is making water affordable in the first place. So we've got several models on water affordability strategies. And then finally, next slide. The third overarching topic in our water toolkit is enabling more effective advocacy. And this is where we're going to be focusing our conversation today. And there are two modules, one on data collection and transparency, and another on accountability and participation in decision making. Next slide, please. And so this slide just is a quick overview of the organization of each of the modules, explaining what you can find in each module, including explanations of the topic, questions to help sort of assess where you are, examples and pitfalls, and other policy ideas to consider. Next slide, please. So here we are today, our deep dive on data collection and transparency. This is just the first page of the module in our toolkit on this topic. Next slide. Oh, I think that's it. And we do have solutions that we explore about how to increase transparency of utility policies and practices through enhanced data reporting that's pretty granular, and obtaining utility data through public records requests, rate setting proceedings, or litigation. Also, legislation is a possibility. And so I wanted to sort of frame today's conversation by noting, by and large, water and wastewater utilities do not routinely collect and report water and wastewater affordability data. So our presenters are going to be describing the particular data points I'm talking about when I say water and wastewater affordability data. And this data is important to provide indicators that there is a water affordability problem in existence or looming. So you look at disconnection data, arrearage data, but there's also other data points in this mix. When you overlay those data points with census data or other data sets, you can get to the environmental justice impacts of policies, and that can inform how your current rate design, affordability programs and policies are working, if there are particular areas within the service territory that are experiencing greater pain, that may need some targeted measures. This data, if you map it, can be a very powerful tool. It also can be a good way to track the effectiveness of policies, rate designs, affordability programs that are being implemented. So this is not, the best kind of data is not just a one snapshot look at how things are, but it's rather regular and routine collection of these data points over time, so you can track changes. Are things getting better? Are things getting worse? Are there particular areas that seem to be in trouble? Again, arrearage, disconnection data, and various data points will be discussed in this conversation. And I'm hoping that folks will take away from this that, one, there's multiple pathways to getting this data. There's not just one way to do it. And that, two, this data is very powerful. It's powerful for building the case for the need for affordability programs and policies in the first place, but also tracking how well those policies and programs are working in the future. So this is a critical, we see, step in the water affordability advocacy sort of movement. And we're hoping that you'll be inspired and tenacious, and we'll go for it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Michael.
So good morning, everyone. I guess it's good morning for me. Good morning, good afternoon for a lot of folks. I see a lot of people I know on this webinar, so I'm very excited to be here to talk about water shutoff reporting requirements in California, along with some other affordability reporting requirements. And I'll start off with a short discussion about why I think this topic matters and why this information matters. So for those of you who don't know me and know Leadership Council, Leadership Council is an environmental and social justice nonprofit based in California in the San Joaquin Valley. Our main office is in Fresno, and we also work in the Eastern Coachella Valley, work with approximately 30 communities in both regions. These are communities that are generally communities of color, lower income communities that are facing a number of different issues, including issues related to access to safe and affordable drinking water and wastewater infrastructure, which is my focus at Leadership Council. So for us, I guess the premise of our work in this area is that access to safe and affordable drinking water and basic sanitation is a human right. In California, that's codified in statute, and I know the United Nations has also recognized both as a human right, and other states have worked on this as well. And from that premise, our conclusion is that no one should lose access to drinking water because of an inability to pay for this essential service. And there's a lot of work to do in California and throughout the country on this issue to get there. And that brings me to a discussion on the prevalence of water shutoffs in California. Unfortunately, far too prevalent. So water rates in California, this really is an affordability issue, rose more than 45% between 2007 and 2015. That trend has continued since then. And in a majority of water systems in California, water bills are now unaffordable for low-income households in that area. And the result is that about 500,000 people, or more than 500,000 people in California, lost access to drinking water because of a water shutoff, at least for a period of time in 2018 and 2019. That resulted in some policy change that I'll discuss. But the biggest thing I think that changed since then was the COVID-19 pandemic, which we all know, and a water shutoff moratorium put in place between April 2020 and December 2022 at which point there should not have been water shutoffs. There were actually some anecdotal reports of water shutoffs, but for the most part, they should have ceased until 2023 or the beginning of 2023. Pacific Institute has also found that Black households are about twice as likely to actually experience disconnection after receiving a notice than a white household, and this is true of Latino households as well. Impacts of water shutoffs on households that we work with when they're shut off is very severe. The threat of water shutoff causes, just the threat alone causes households to make trade-offs between other essential services that they need to pay for, including electricity, rent, food, medications, etc. And these are things nobody should have to go without because they're trying to pay their water or their sewer bill. But it's the unfortunate reality that it's often the case. Water shutoffs can also impose additional expenses, including disconnection and reconnection fees, which we've tried to limit to an extent, cost to purchase bottled water, late fees, penalties. These are severe impacts. They're also inherently stressful, which is something that I think is a little overlooked. And shutting off an essential service as a collection tool, in our opinion, is coercive, and it's collection under duress. Water shutoffs also elevate the risk of catastrophic fire and the ability to respond to fire when they happen in a household. We actually saw 2 households burn down last year because of water shutoffs. These were actually household water system interruptions and not disconnections for inability to pay, but same principle. And then loss of access to drinking water and wastewater for basic sanitation is a severe threat to health of residents, which was demonstrated in a couple of studies during the pandemic, which showed that moratoria on utility disconnections actually lowered both infection and mortality rates. And those are linked there if you want to do some more reading. So data collection, I think, is important for a number of reasons, including just understanding what the problem is, understanding that there is a problem, and then kind of pushing solutions forward to address those problems tailored to what the data actually shows is out there. In California, there are 2 statutes that allow the State Water Resources Control Board to require regular reporting from water systems related to this information. The first is Health and Safety Code 116530, and the second is 116918. I won't read those in detail, but they allow the state board really broad discretion to determine how often water systems report, what they report, and the form in which they report. And I'll also note in the bolded language in 116530, we were able to extend the authority of the State Water Board to collect some of this data in a bill that we worked on for several years. It was SB 200 passed in 2019, which established funding for drinking water solutions. And I think it points to the need to look forward to future campaigns when you're fortunate enough to actually make policy change. Look for the next one, and that for us has been addressing water affordability and shutoffs. So based on this authority, the State Water Board has established an electronic annual report, which water systems must complete. It's an annual survey, so it's annual data, not monthly data. I think that's really important, and that's a flaw in this reporting requirement. The questions are established by the State Water Board through a notice and comment period. They're often revised, and new sections are included pretty regularly. It includes 18 sections, a lot of basic data like contacts for the water system, how many connections they serve. I think the most important information is in section 8 of the electronic annual report in California, which includes information about rate structures, customer charges, including reconnection and disconnection fees, availability of assistance programs, and I think most critical to this discussion, reporting regarding water shutoffs, total water shutoffs, occupied versus unoccupied units, single family versus multifamily, and then the duration of the water shutoffs. So not just the average, but also kind of different buckets on how long the water shutoff has occurred and for how many households face that. So 2, 4, 8 days, and 30 days and longer. In addition to this electronic annual reporting, there's also reporting that's in many ways a little stronger, that's applicable to investor-owned utilities. This arose out of the COVID-19 pandemic and the need to understand the impacts of that pandemic or the pandemic on water shutoffs and water affordability. So the California Public Utility Commission has required monthly reporting. So that's one way that it's stronger, it's monthly, not annual, about water shutoffs, arrearages, and a number of other kind of important data points related to water affordability and shutoffs. And that data reporting has continued even though the water shutoff moratorium has since been lifted. And I hope it does continue. And then I think no reporting requirement is complete without enforcement. So this reporting in California is mandatory. There are a number of different enforcement tools. The first is that the State Water Board can enforce these requirements. And also, I didn't mention the California Public Utilities Commission can also enforce its own requirements. I think interestingly, in California, there was a bill, that SB 99-8, which is the Water Shutoff Protection Act of 2018, that allows the Attorney General to enforce reporting requirements along with protections, due process protections before a shutoff can occur. And the Attorney General this year, just recently, has started to take some steps to notify water systems that these requirements are in fact mandatory, and those that are not complying may face legal action and enforcement. Improvements needed in the reporting requirements in California. One is more frequent reporting for all but the investor-owned utilities that are reporting monthly. For the rest, I think we need monthly reporting, at least for water shutoff data and arrearages. Zip code data we're not getting for the most part, although there is precedent for it in California. The state board had a survey, collected some zip code data related to arrearages as a one-time survey, and the larger water systems had that data and were able to report it. So I think that's one key point. That data is available. Don't let any water system tell you that it's not. The larger water systems at least have it. And then I think we need policy change to further restrict residential shutoffs and to make water and sewer bills more affordable. To that point, 3 legislative proposals I'll briefly talk about because I think I'm running out of time. One is SB 223. This was a bill that we sponsored, authored by Senator Dodd in 2021. And it's a little painful for me because we worked pretty hard on it, got it through 2 policy committees, and then it died in, it's called Senate Appropriations, which is a fiscal committee. And in part, the reason this bill didn't move forward, which would have required additional reporting, including zip code level data, didn't move forward in part because we didn't have data showing that there was in fact still a water shutoff problem after 998, the Water Shutoff Protection Act, which had just gone into effect. And we were also during the moratorium. So it's tough to show that there was actually a problem. We'll try to make some movement in that area in future years. And then SB 222 was a bill last year. We used a lot of this shutoff data to show the need for a low-income rate assistance program for water and sewer bills. Actually got that bill passed through the legislature. Governor Newsom vetoed the bill because of lack of a funding source identified. It wouldn't have gone into effect until one was identified, but that was a problem for the governor. So that's another bill that we hope to bring back soon. And then this year, SB 3, if passed, would or will extend water shutoff reporting and protections to very small community water systems, those with fewer than 200 connections, which are currently exempt for some of those requirements, so aren't subject to these reporting requirements. Happy to answer questions, and if there aren't any now, I'll turn it over to Karen. Thank y'all.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. All right. Can everyone see that? Great. Okay. So I, along with led by Larry, Olivia, Sam Willens, and also Bernita Haynes from NCLC, Larry and Sam from NRDC, worked on the Water Affordability Toolkit So in this conversation we'll have today, we'll be focusing some attention on that, as well as a statute in Illinois that requires zip code level data for utilities, and also the model statute that's been promoted and established by the Democracy Utility Project. First, a little bit about NCLC. Since 1969, NCLC, whoops. Can you still see my screen?
We can see it.
Okay, great. NCLC is based in Boston and Washington, D.C. We work for consumer justice and economic security for low-income and other disadvantaged people, including older adults, and we do so through policy analysis, advocacy, publications, litigation, and expert witnesses, services, and training. So again, here's the roadmap for what we'll be talking about today. First, talk about the Water Advocacy Toolkit, evolution of zip code level reporting by investor-owned utilities in Illinois, and the sort of evolution of how that statute came to be, and then a brief introduction to the Energy Democracy Project's Utility Data Transparency Model Statute. So, to state the obvious, and something that Olivia, I think, had briefly highlighted in her introduction, is that data helps advocates tell the story of what's happening on the ground and for the advocacy they want to promote. Data can provide advocates with important information about water affordability burdens, communities and in neighborhoods most impacted by unaffordable water bills, and utilities credit and collection policies. Sometimes that gets lost in the conversation among advocates, like what actually is the utilities policy when it comes to disconnecting customer, because there's a lot of discretion there. Whether there are disproportionate impacts of water bill burdens and collection policies by the utilities by race, where outreach efforts for available affordability and assistance programs should be aimed, and whether new or existing policies and programs are actually effective in ensuring affordability and uninterrupted access to affordable utility service. There's a link at the bottom there to the Water Toolkit. And again, most water and wastewater utilities we know in the US are not required to collect or report data, unfortunately, such as information on rate increases, customer bills, or credit and collection practices. So the baseline information that we need to assess the full extent and impact of unaffordable water bills is often unavailable to regulators, advocates, and the public. And that data gap gets especially significant for the majority of water systems in the US that are not regulated by state utility commissions. Because the state utility commissions often, and most of the time, are limited to the investor-owned water utilities, in addition to the electric and gas utilities. At the national level, we know no agency tracks water affordability data in the country. And so, the result is, again, to state the obvious, the lack of reliable data impedes efforts to convince decision makers of the urgency of water affordability challenges, build momentum and pressure for change, as Michael highlighted when he mentioned that one of the problems they faced in California related to legislation they were promoting was the lack of data. I want to give a shout out to NAACP's Legal Defense Fund 2019 report, which many of you may have read or are familiar with, on the disproportionate impact of rising water bills on Black communities. It's just really an incredible report. It details the story of NAACP's litigation against the City of Cleveland's water department. It highlights the importance of data collection and building your case for needed change. In its challenge of the city's practices of placing liens on residents' properties due to overdue water bills and other allegations of discriminatory impacts of water policies and disconnections. So again, there's a link to that. It's something any water advocate should check out. A lack of data transparency in water rates and impacts. Again, importance of data collection has been highlighted in other publications. Recent Lawrence Berkeley National Lab report called Advancing Equity in Utility Regulation has, pieces, chapters applying to all utilities, but certainly the need for data also applies to water utilities. The contributing authors, two of whom were NCLC advocates, John Howitt and Jen Bosco, stress the importance of obtaining zip code level data at a minimum when working toward more equitable practices in electric and gas utility regulation. Again, highlighting the narrower the geographic area, the more accurately one can analyze the disparate impacts. And of course, again, that applies to water as well. And again, the granular data, especially critical to identify disparities related to race and ethnicity, since it can be correlated then with local demographic data from the census. Again, same rationale applies to the water sector. So I wanted to highlight the list of data. I won't read it all here, but you can see this is the recommendations made in those authors about the data that should be collected. I see a little typo in one of the bullet numbers. I will correct that before we make the slides available. But you see here all of the kinds of credit collection, arrearage data that's important to gather by zip code to be able to tell the story of unaffordability, discrimination, whatever the problems that happen to be in the service territory or service territories you're concerned with. The water toolkit provides a listing of additional data advocates may want to obtain, and that includes rates. Can't forget about the rates, right? That's particularly true for public water, publicly owned water utilities that may not have very good websites or public-facing data, and water bills at standard levels of usage, average median dollar amount billed to residential accounts, average median usage per account, fees and penalties assessed in addition to late fees. It's important to have an understanding, right, of what's happening in terms of affordability and what that means in terms of fees. Average and or a median amount of arrears. Again, you can tell your story, especially if you have it by zip code, of what's happening in terms of affordability within a particular area. And the arrearage data shows that. Policies concerning shutoffs, reconnections, liens, late fees, all of these really important credit and collections practices that really personally impact people who are struggling to afford utility service. And as I'll talk later, there's so much to know about these policies by utility, because even with the investor-owned utilities, they have great discretion in terms of how their implementation of policies and actually how they implement changes in policies, how they determine who and when people get disconnected, et cetera. Billing practices, frequency of billing, affordability and assistance programs. Unfortunately, there aren't many available, as we know, in the water utility space, but it's important to the extent they do exist that people are aware of them. Use of liens, other debt collection practices. So, and then two, for publicly owned systems, what's happening with the funds that are actually collected by a city government for its water system? In an effort to balance budgets, are some of those revenues being transferred to non-utility government accounts? That's important to find out. again, when building your advocacy case, there are several starting points that begin with data collection. And then, so first identifying if it's an investor-owned utility, then you're before the commission, a Public Utilities Commission. But if your utility is publicly owned, are there state sunshine laws, also known as FOIA laws, that you can use to obtain data? Importantly, especially for smaller community-based organizations who are trying to make the case for change, are there academics or advocacy groups, local universities in the area that might be interested in helping to collect and analyze water utility data? These are the places that have the resources, the interests, and the expertise to help make a case for change. And if data aren't otherwise available, is it possible to obtain information by participating in an investor-owned utility rate case or other litigated proceedings? Again, that's in the investor-owned utility space. And if so, would your state consumer advocate's office, if one exists, or the state's attorney general's office, assuming they handle the residential customer representation before a public utility commission, can they help you navigate the process? Work with them to co-sponsor information, and often AG offices or consumer advocates office don't have that personal testimony of what's happening on the ground. They'll have, wonderful expert witness testimony, but I think it's important too, we know, to tell the stories of what's happening on the ground. And that's where community-based organizations can really, really make a difference. Larry will talk more about a wonderful new Jersey utility reporting law, but I wanted to highlight, since I'm based in Illinois, examples of zip code level data reporting requirements that are now in existence here in Illinois. Illinois is one of two states. I think New Jersey is the other. Again, Larry will talk about that. That requires reporting of utility credit and collections data by zip code. Although admittedly, and unfortunately, the requirements apply only to investor-owned electric, gas, water, and sewer utilities. Prior to the statute, the data initially was obtained through COVID-related discussions. In those litigation or in those negotiations, settlement documents were traded back and forth. And what we continually did, even if we were losing other proposals or provisions, we said, no, we want zip code level reporting. And in the end, the utilities agreed to it. So there was a lesson there. If you're in a negotiation with the utility and they say they can't do it, they just can't do it. Just, you may have to give up another policy change that you wanted, but if you insist on the data, eventually they may come around because we know they can do it. And so that zip code level reporting that occurred during the COVID shutdown in Illinois, again, monthly reporting by zip code, was codified into law in 2021. So now we're getting monthly credit and collections data from all of the investor-owned electric, gas, and water utilities, including customer disconnections, notices of disconnections, reconnections, deposits, late fees, success in completing DPAs and the number of defaults on DPAs, the number of customers in arrears of 30 days or more, and the dollar value of those arrearages. So again, all of that data helps tell the story by zip code of where affordability problems exist. And I want to show you this zip code that the ICC, to its credit, this dashboard that they've created now that we have the monthly zip code data. The more I dig into it, the more I'm just astounded by its awesomeness. Here's one screenshot. It gives customer counts. Of course, you always have to start with the customer counts because you can't talk about percentages unless you know the total customers. But you've got the customers receiving disconnect notices, disconnected, customers reconnected. Unfortunately, I would say one fault in the reporting is we don't know yet how long people are disconnected. But then we get also reconnection data. This is just a screenshot. Again, there's the arrearage data, the deposit, late fees, and the amount of the arrearages. And it's also separated or aggregated by not only by customer class, but also by low income and total residential customers. And low income customers are defined as customers who are on LIHEAP or the state's percentage of income payment plan program. Again, and digging around on the dashboard too, when you click on some of these indicators, you actually get the heat maps that show what's happening by zip code. So it's really, really a nice tool for advocates, the public, regulators to figure out exactly, again, what's happening with affordability. There it is again. And then I want to move on to the Energy Democracy Project's Model Data Collection Statute. Energy Democracy Project is a collaboration of more than 30 diverse local frontline organizations across the U.S. designed to strengthen their collective efforts to democratize energy and advance the emerging energy democracy movement in the U.S.
Hey, Karen, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to flag that we are quickly running out of time. So if you could kind of zip through this section so Larry can have a turn, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yes, sorry about that. So here's just a quick slide. This tells you what's in that model statute. It's very complete. It's got preambles, definitions, the sources of data. 21 points for monthly credit and collections reporting, kind of a soup to nuts dream, advocates dream of what kind of data might be needed. But I wanted to quickly highlight additional data points in the model statute that I think are particularly helpful. The number of customers whose accounts were referred to third parties for the purpose of debt collection. So these kinds of post debt collection disconnection activities that are really tell the story of what's happening to people, whether they're being, their due process rights are being violated through hearings that they may not get notice of, wages garnished, etc. Liens, that kind of information is also important. Same here, these two slides, the next few slides show specific activities that commissions should take in terms of annual reporting. And then also, importantly, requires the commission to open proceeding on the reporting of the data that's been gathered. Because we can have the data, but unless it's analyzed and brought to the public and the regulators are forced to examine it, then it may be difficult for change to occur. And then this is the kinds of findings and recommendations that the commission is required to make under this model statute. So that's it. Sorry for going over, and here's our contact information, and happy to answer any questions.
All right, thanks, Karen. Hi, all. I think it's now officially afternoon for everyone on, unless you're not in the continental United States right now. Good afternoon. So my name is Larry Levine. I'm a senior attorney with NRDC. I'm going to focus mainly on New Jersey, but add a few other thoughts as well to close us out and then transition into Q&A. So New Jersey, I think it's fair to say now actually has the strongest data reporting law in the country on these issues. And I'll explain why that is and what the law looks like. I'm going to go through how does it work, what data get reported, how did it come about, and what are some of the emerging issues around implementation. This law was just passed, just signed by the governor last fall. When you get the PowerPoint, you'll have a hyperlink here to directly to the text of the law. Okay, so here's what some of the important features of this are. It covers all water and wastewater systems. It also covers electric and gas in the same law, just as the Illinois law does. It covers utilities as a whole, not just water. But also the all is underlined there because it's not just those that are regulated by the State Utility Commission, which typically are the ones that are investor owned or otherwise privately owned. It covers all, including publicly owned, which is the majority of water and sewer systems. In New Jersey, all of the reporting though goes to the Utility Commission, even by the publicly owned systems that aren't otherwise regulated by the Commission. And the law provides a consultative role for another state agency which exercises financial oversight over local governments and local publicly owned utilities. But it was decided to centralize the data collection and analysis in one place with the State Utility Commission. The data is submitted quarterly, but it's broken down monthly. And it's required to be posted both on a state website in raw downloadable form that can be worked with by anyone, and also posted on the utility's own website simultaneous with their submission to the state. Folks who are in the know may know that there's state collection of the data going on and a central place to look. Folks who are interested in their utility may not know that, but may be wanting to find information on their utility's website, and so they'll find it there too. And as with the model law and the Illinois law that Karen mentioned, this New Jersey law requires the State Utility Commission to evaluate the data, to make some findings based on an analysis about whether current affordability assistance programs are adequate to meet the need of current need and anticipated future needs. Okay, so what actually gets reported? Again, another reason why I think this is the strongest in the country is it includes that zip code level breakdown. Illinois does as well, but again, New Jersey's covers all of the utilities. It has a breakdown by customer class, so distinguishing residential from non-residential and other customer classes. And here are the major data points that it covers. And there's a lot more detail of what each of these means in the particular breakdowns within these categories, but here are the categories. It covers shutoffs and reconnections, including shutoff notices and actual shutoffs. It covers liens that are imposed on properties or enforced or sold that can result in the loss of someone's property due to unpaid water bills. It covers arrears, and it's got it broken down by how long overdue the bills are. It covers deferred payment agreements, how utilities are allowing people to pay back debt over time and how successful that is. Covers fees, penalties, interest that attach to overdue bills. It includes information about assistance programs, how many people are applying, are participating, how much money are they getting. It requires the utilities to submit a description of what kind of communications they have to their customers about the availability of any assistance programs and about consumer protections and rights that they have as customers. There's reporting required on rates, on typical usage, so that in order to be able to understand what the typical bills would be, and it does require bills. Yeah, I believe it may be average and median. I can't recall now which, or if it's both, but it's got rates, typical usage, typical bills, and then utility revenues as well to understand that some of the context. I think it lacks some of the other points that were mentioned by others. For example, of that revenue, how much might be going to purposes other than operation and maintenance and improvement of the utility. That's one thing that's not there, but there is a data point around revenues. Okay, so how did this law come about? I think just like the Illinois and the California stories, pandemic was really a catalyst. Pre-pandemic, there was already a growing awareness in New Jersey of the challenges of water affordability. There had been some really great work done by Rutgers gathering sort of manually one at a time, gathering the rate schedules from hundreds of utilities and overlaying that with demographic and census data around income, and doing a census tract level analysis of the extent to which there's a likely challenge of people paying water bills. And they estimated that in the neighborhood of 20% of the state is likely challenged to pay their water bill. There's a growing awareness of the costs of the need for investment in improving the state's water infrastructure, as is true across the country. New Jersey's got some really significant needs, and how that in turn will be a driver of continuing rate increases. So those things were starting to bubble up, and then we hit COVID, and the state adopted a utility shutoff moratorium. There's a coalition of groups that worked on that and on some related protections during the pandemic, and I think it was an interesting coalition. NRDC was part of that. But in addition to environmental groups, AARP was the state chapter in New Jersey. The AARP was another leading group in that. A lot of seniors are on fixed income and low and moderate income. And AARP often intervenes in utility rate cases around the country, actually. They were very active on this. The State Legal Services organization that provides direct representation to low-income individuals and families on all sorts of legal issues, including utility issues. They, on a policy advocacy basis, were involved in this coalition. And so there were relationships built with legislators around the moratorium issue. And some of those same legislators became involved in developing and advancing legislation for data reporting in order to understand the impacts of the pandemic, and also to be able to understand going forward what the nature of the challenges are, and to be able to inform further policymaking by the legislature and by others. During the pandemic, the Utility Commission itself did impose some reporting on the investor-owned utilities. There was a fair number of the data points that are in the law were part of that too, not all of them, and not in exactly the same way. But there was some data starting to be generated, including by zip code, from the investor-owned utilities. And so we were able to build on that, that could be done, and that the data was showing providing valuable insights, and build on that for this legislation. Another, I think, key factor was that this law covers all the utility sectors, water and energy. And what that, I think, allowed for was an appeal to just a principle of parity, right? These are all essential utility services. In some cases, advocacy around water specifically is really effective, and it's not to. In both both approaches can be effective in the right context. I think here it proved to be effective to be combining water and energy advocacy together, and some of those other partners in the coalition primarily had worked on energy, also on water, and they became more invested in the water piece too. But so parity around water and energy, parity around, regardless of whether you're served by a publicly owned or a privately owned utility, having the same data available. That even extended to some of the substantive policies around shutoff protections. At the same time that this policy movement was happening in New Jersey around transparency, we also had adoption of a law providing winter shutoff protections for low-income households of all water utilities. Previously, there was a program that applied for energy, didn't apply to water at all, and it applied only to investor-owned systems. This now applied it to all utility systems, including water, whether investor-owned or whether publicly owned. So that principle of parity, I think, was really important, both on the data side and on creating stronger protections. And then, as you might expect, this effort, the bill passed last year, was informed by similar efforts going on elsewhere, by what had been happening in California and Illinois and elsewhere. Here's looking ahead, some of the emerging issues. So the law was enacted in the fall. It's really just getting underway to get data coming in. The reporting obligations really began pretty quickly after the effective date, but in reality, it's been a bit slow. And in part, that's because the State Utility Commission staff really needed to develop a standardized reporting template, which they did not have at the outset and is actually still in development. Hope that that's getting close to being done and ready. They're having at the urging of advocates and of the utilities, frankly. They've solicited a lot of feedback, anticipating there's going to be some stakeholder discussion around different points of view that were expressed around the feedback on a draft template. And we'll move towards finalizing something. That whole conversation has been mainly with the investor-owned utilities, because that's who the Utility Commission knows. And that's who's typically at the table in stakeholder discussions with the Board of Public Utilities. The law covers everybody else, and they're not really at the table yet. And that's going to be an important thing to create a process and a template and a mechanism for reporting that's going to be suitable and effective and efficient for those utilities as well, for those publicly owned ones. And so we really need to broaden the conversation in practice, even though on paper, the same obligations apply. We've got to make it real. Also, I think to be determined how the data will be presented and analyzed, right? So will they do a dashboard along the lines of what Illinois did? I think that would be terrific. We don't have a commitment to do that at this point. And it's still evolving kind of how that data is going to be made available. And similarly, what kind of analysis will the Utility Commission do with the data in order to make the findings and recommendations that the law requires them to make? And then last, looking ahead, obviously the purpose of all this, using that data to drive policy forward. And so as data do come in, we'll be figuring out what we can do with it, what analysis we can do, what capacities we can bring from partners, for academics and others to help do that work and use it for advocacy. So the last thing I wanted to touch on is that the utility sector itself, water and sewer utilities, I think are the more progressive among them, are starting to recognize the value of this kind of data. And I think that's really significant. And I'll give a couple of examples here of two reports from within the last year or so. The U.S. Water Alliance in the fall put out a report that covered a pilot program they did with about 7 or 8 cities that they called the Preventing Water Shutoffs pilot. And that involved, in the first instance, looking at data with those utilities and in partnership with community members, community-based organizations in those utilities service areas, to understand what the nature of the problem was, and then to develop some policy approaches to help avoid shutoffs. Right? And this graph I have up here is just one example of the kind of data analysis that they did. This is a look at percentage distribution of short and long shutoff lengths by median household income. Right, so this is where they were able to have zip code level data on not only the number of shutoffs, but how long it took until there was a reconnection, and to overlay that with census data on household income, because you have a zip code breakdown. Right, and so this was able to identify patterns to see that, in fact, lower income households had longer shutoffs, which is not surprising. But is demonstrable, right, through this approach and through the availability of these data. And in this case, it was the utilities that were making the data available in a collaborative way with their customers, with community organizations, out of a commitment to understanding the situation and seeking solutions. And the U.S. Water Alliance, together in conjunction with this report, they put out a data collection and analysis guide aimed towards utilities. Useful for advocates too, but they framed it around utilities. If you want to understand your problem, here are some of the steps you can take. Here are some of the data points you need. Here's how to approach it. And the other is this Aspen Institute report from a series of roundtable discussions that I participated in, that a number of others from other advocates and frontline communities and utility sector folks and finance folks and regulatory folks and a cross-section of the water sector. It came up with a whole series of findings and recommendations around water affordability. And one of those specifically is about data. There was a shared recognition of the need for data collection in order to have metrics, in order to identify the nature of the problem, to track the effectiveness of solutions, to devise appropriate policy solutions. And so that was, and in that same report, by the way, the participants signed on to the notion of access to water as a human right. Right. So there are some really constructive conversations that went on there that were reflected in this roundtable report. And I emphasize that because there were progressive members of the utility sector that were part of that conversation. And so there's a growing openness to this whole conversation, I think. So I'll just close here with there's a link that was in the chat earlier to the full toolkit. If you want to hold up your phone to the screen, the QR code will bring you there. Got contact information for me and for Olivia, who are the point people on the overall toolkit project. And we'd be more than happy to talk with you about any of these issues or other aspects of the toolkit.
Thank you. We are sort of down to our last 3 minutes and have a few questions coming in. If we don't address it here, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll do our best. But here's a question for the group. For states starting a one-time data collection survey, partnering with a local university, what resources do you suggest to help write and administer that survey to get a statistical significant representation of shutoffs, arrearages, rates? There are 2,500 Group A community water systems in this state. Advice?
I would mention, point to the Water Affordability Toolkit, which has some really nice resources, including a set of proposed discovery questions that can be kind of used as data point starting points. Also, Martha Davis from Northeastern University School of Law was a really important participant in being interviewed for the toolkit, and she forwarded sort of FOIA information, sample letters, had specific recommendations about how to start the process of data collection, especially for a publicly owned water system.
Olivia, I want to, I'm seeing the time running. The last two questions I want to quickly take a stab at. So Eric's question, to what extent have utility billing system providers and vendors been engaged to discuss how data could be collected or reported? Great question. So in addition to the examples I gave of this US Water Alliance pilot, in some of the places where we're working, there are ongoing conversations with utilities and with utility associations. Michigan is actually a really good example of that, where there's legislation that's pending, and there's been an ongoing conversation between advocates and the sponsor of that bill and the state chapter of the American Water Works Association around really drilling down into the details of what makes sense to have and what's workable and what's doable to have as reporting requirements that would serve everyone's purposes. So there are some similar conversations that I know of that are in some cases I'm involved in that are happening in other places too. So there is more of that needed, absolutely. And the other on the federal level, is there any momentum? So the House passed version of the bipartisan infrastructure law last year included some language around this, did not make it into the final bill. Also included some money that would have gone to utilities to help them improve their data management systems to be able to collect and provide this sort of data. I know that the HHS office that runs LIWOP, the federal office, is doing some data collection in addition to analyzing data that comes in through their program. They're doing some additional research. So yeah, there's starting to be some, and EPA has got $3 million from the most recent appropriations bill to do a needs assessment study nationally on need for low-income water assistance.
Fantastic.
I was just going to throw in the model data statute too from the Democracy Project. Includes a provision in the model bill that essentially requests appropriation for funding for these smaller utilities to begin that process of being able to collect the data.
We are actually over time, and I wanted to thank everybody for hanging in there and staying engaged in this conversation. Please, there's contact information in these PowerPoint slides and materials. Please feel free to reach out. We're very excited about data collection and hopefully have conveyed the significance of getting started. So thank you very much and hope to talk to you all again soon.